The toy was broken. That was all Maren Solis knew for certain when the hatchling found her. She was elbow-deep in the belly of a Verath-class atmospheric processor, the kind of machine that colonial engineers called a widowmaker because it had a habit of killing the people who didn't respect it. Her knuckles were split. She had a smear of hydraulic fluid across her jaw that she kept forgetting about, and a cup of cold calf balanced on a coolant pipe 3 inches from her right knee. She had been at it for 6 hours. She would be at it for 6 more. That was the job. That was always the job. The Dracari station Vrethsaluna hung in the upper atmosphere of a gas giant the humans had quietly nicknamed Big Orange, because no one had bothered to learn its proper designation, and the proper designation was 47 syllables long anyway. The station was the size of a small city. It processed atmospheric gases and converted them to fuel cells. It employed 11,000 Dracari, and as of 8 months ago, 1 human mechanic on a temporary contract that had been renewed 3 times because nobody else could keep the human-built auxiliary processors running, and because Maren Solis was, by any objective measure, the best field engineer the Colonial Mechanics Union had ever licensed. She did not find this comforting. She found it exhausting. The hatchling arrived without warning, which was how Dracari hatchlings tended to arrive everywhere. It came around the corner of the processor housing at a fast, tumbling scramble, 4 limbs, a tail it hadn't fully learned to control, wings folded tight against a body that still had the soft bronze sheen of early scaling. It was maybe 3 months out of the clutch. Its eyes, when they found Maren, were the bright amber of new coin, enormous in its narrow face. It stopped when it saw her. Hatchlings always stopped when they saw her. She was the wrong shape, the wrong color, the wrong smell. She didn't have scales. She only had 2 limbs for walking. She was a thing that should not exist on Vrethsaluna, and hatchlings, whose category systems were still forming, were fascinated and disturbed by things that should not exist. Maren pulled a rag from her pocket and wiped her hands. "Hey," she said. Not in Dracari. She still only had about 400 words of Dracari, not enough for complex conversation. Just in standard, in the same low, easy voice she used with feral dogs and skittish horses and machines that were about to do something stupid. The hatchling stared at her. Then it opened its small claws, and it held up the object it had been carrying, and it made a sound. Maren had heard Dracari hatchlings make sounds before. They could produce the full adult range, the subsonic resonance, the sharp clicking, the ascending tonal calls that served as names and warnings and declarations of territory. But this sound was different. This sound was the same in every language, on every world, in every species that Maren had ever worked alongside. She had heard it from human children. She had heard it from the young of 3 other species in her years of contract work. It was the sound of a small creature that had something it loved, and the thing it loved was broken. She set down her wrench. The toy was a mechanical model of some creature, a flying creature, wings spread, built from interlocking segments of some lightweight alloy. It had moving parts. It was meant to move. That was obvious from the way the wings were jointed, from the small winding mechanism in the body. It was a beautiful thing, actually, the kind of precise and delicate engineering that reminded Maren that the Dracari had been building machines for 6,000 years before humanity had figured out the wheel. One of the wing joints was sheared. Not broken outright, the piece was still there, still attached, but the pin that held the rotation mechanism had slipped its housing and the wing hung wrong, and when the hatchling tried to wind the toy and set it going, the wing dragged and caught, and the whole thing shuddered to a dead stop. Maren looked at it for a long moment. The hatchling looked at her. "All right," she said, "come here. Let me see." She said it in standard, knowing the hatchling didn't understand standard, knowing it didn't matter. Tone was universal. The hatchling came forward 3 cautious steps and extended its claws with the toy balanced on them, and Maren took it with the kind of careful, 2-handed grip she used for precision components, the kind of grip that said, I know what this is worth." The pin was the problem. She could see it immediately. The housing had a slight manufacturing defect, a tolerance error, maybe 0.02 of a millimeter, not enough to fail in testing, but enough to fail under use and the micro-vibrations of an atmospheric processor station. The pin had been walking itself out of the housing for weeks, probably, until finally it had walked far enough that the wing no longer seated right. She needed a pin of the right diameter. She needed something to reseat it. She reached into the breast pocket of her work jacket and found, as she almost always found, a collection of small things. A calibration pick, 3 spare fasteners of the type used in the auxiliary processor housings, 2 of which were slightly too large and one of which was. She held it up, squinted at it in the low amber light of the access corridor. Close enough if she could modify it. She took out her calibration pick and spent 40 seconds shaping the fastener against the edge of the processor housing, filing it down by feel and habit, and 8 years of doing exactly this kind of thing in exactly this kind of cramped space, with exactly this kind of inadequate light. Then she reseated the pin, worked the wing joint back into alignment, and wound the mechanism 1/4 turn. The toy moved. The wings beat in the small, precise cycle they had been built to beat. The creature rose on its mechanical current of air, rotating slowly, and the hatchling made a sound that Marin had no word for in any language she spoke, but that she understood completely. She held the toy out. The hatchling took it with both claws, clutched it to its chest, and then, and this surprised her, though it probably shouldn't have, it pressed its narrow forehead briefly against the back of Marin's scarred hand. Then it turned and scrambled away around the corner. Marin watched it go. She picked up her wrench. She picked up her cold calf. She went back to work. She did not know that she had been watched. The Dracari had no word that translated precisely to emperor. The closest approximation in standard was something between sovereign of sovereigns and the one who was before us, and in the formal court dialect, it was rendered as a sound that human vocal cords could not produce without electronic assistance. So the colonial diplomatic corps had simply agreed, decades ago, to use the word emperor, and the Dracari had found this both inaccurate and charming, and had chosen not to correct it. Orenvethsalanikal was the one who was before them. He had been ruling for longer than the human colonial era had existed. He was 340 years old, which for his species was early middle age. He stood 11 feet tall in the formal posture, and carried, in the colored patterns of his scaling, the entire lineage of the Vrethsalana bloodline, 8 generations of emperors, written in his skin in red and gold, and the deep blue-black that their language called the color of void between stars. His wings, fully spread, could shade a courtyard. His voice, at full projection, could crack stone. He was here on Vrethsaluna atmospheric station because of the storm. Not a metaphorical storm, a literal one. It had begun, as catastrophes often do, with something that was supposed to be beneficial. 80 days ago, the Dracari Science Directorate had activated a new atmospheric collection array designed to increase the station's energy yield by 40%. The array functioned by using a directed resonance beam to ionize the gas layers of Big Orange at specific altitudes, pulling concentrated fuel cell precursors into the collection processors in volumes previously impossible. The array had worked exactly as designed for 61 days. On the 62nd day, the resonance beam had encountered an atmospheric anomaly in Big Orange's equatorial band, a subsurface convection current that the survey models had missed, and had, instead of ionizing a clean layer, started ionizing a churning, chemically unstable mass of compressed gas the size of a continent. What followed was not a storm in any ordinary sense. It was a cascade. Cyclonic systems 300 kilometers wide spinning up in hours. Discharge events that lit the upper atmosphere like a second sun. And at the center of it, something the Dracari meteorological team had only ever theorized. A hypercanic vortex, drawing the smaller systems into itself, growing. A wound in the atmosphere of Big Orange that was already 3 times the width of the station's orbital path. If it reached full hypercanic formation, it would destabilize the entire equatorial band. The shockwave would propagate outward at several hundred kilometers per second. The station Vrethsaluna would cease to exist. The 11,000 Dracari aboard it would cease to exist. So would one human mechanic, but nobody in the Science Directorate was thinking about that. Marin was thinking about it. She was thinking about it because Directorate Engineer Suvith Kaul, who was young, ambitious, technically brilliant, and had the bedside manner of a malfunctioning gyroscope, had arrived at her workstation 4 days ago and told her, in clipped and clearly humiliating standard, that the human auxiliary processors were the only systems currently capable of running the computational models needed to calculate the resonance beam's counterfrequency, and that she was therefore required to ensure they remained operational for the duration of the crisis. "How long is the duration of the crisis?" Marin had asked. Suvith Kaul had looked at her the way the Dracari often looked at humans, with the particular expression that meant, "I am processing your continued existence as an abstract concept, rather than a physical reality." "Unknown," Suvith Kaul had said, "between 12 and 72 hours. That had been 4 days ago. The processors had been running continuously for 96 hours. In that time, Marin had slept for 6 of them. She had eaten 3 times, twice while still working. She had replaced 2 processor cooling units, rerouted power through 4 secondary conduits when the main feed started showing stress fractures, and rebuilt the primary data relay from spare parts, and, in one memorable moment of desperation, a length of Dracari load-bearing cable that was emphatically not rated for electrical use, but had worked anyway. The storm was still growing. The hypercanic vortex was still consolidating. And the Science Directorate still hadn't found the right counterfrequency. Marin was under the main processor housing, lying on her back with her legs sticking out, when the Emperor's shadow fell over her feet. She felt it before she saw it, the shift in the amber light of the corridor, the way the air pressure changed slightly when something very large moved through a confined space. She slid out from under the housing and looked up. Orenveth Salanakal regarded her from a height of 11 feet with eyes that were the color of old amber shot through with red, the eyes of a creature that had seen 3 centuries of history and found most of it beneath comment. His scaling caught the work lights and threw them back in patterns of gold and void blue. He was alone, no escort, no attendants, and he was standing in an access corridor that he had to duck slightly to fit into, looking at a human mechanic who was covered in hydraulic fluid and had a screwdriver tucked behind her ear. Marin sat up. She had been briefed, when she first took the contract, on Dracari Imperial Protocol. There was a great deal of it. It involved specific postures, specific vocalizations, specific rules about eye contact, and the angle at which one presented one's neck, and roughly 40 other things that she had written down and subsequently lost. She remembered 2 things from that briefing. Don't show your teeth unless explicitly invited to, and don't speak first. She did not show her teeth. She did not speak first. The Emperor looked at her for a very long time. Then he made a sound, low, resonant, a single descending tone, and one of the Dracari attendants who had apparently been hovering just out of sight behind him stepped forward and said, in precise standard, "The Emperor Sovereign asks, are you the small scaleless one who repaired the hatchling's toy?" Marin blinked. "Yes," she said. The attendant translated. The Emperor made another sound, this one shorter, flatter. The attendant said, "He asks why." Marin thought about this. "Because it was broken," she said, "and the little one was upset, and I could fix it." The attendant translated. The Emperor was silent for longer this time. His tail moved in a slow, deliberate arc. Marin had learned enough Dracari body language to know that this was the equivalent of a human settling deeper into thought. Then he spoke at length, a full sentence, the sound of it filling the corridor. The attendant said, "He says the hatchling is the 7th clutch youngest of the Solana line. The toy was made by the Emperor's own mate in the 4th year of their bonding. His mate passed into the dark current 11 years ago. He did not know the toy still existed. He did not know the hatchling had found it." Marin said nothing. She was not sure there was anything to say. The attendant continued, "He says a human repaired a thing made by a Drakari Empress's hands, for a Drakari hatchling's grief, without being asked, without expectation of reward, in a place of no consequence in a corridor of a working station. He says he has lived for 340 years, and he does not yet understand humans. He says this troubles him less than it once did." Another pause, another long sound from the Emperor. "He asks," the attendant said, "how long until the processors can provide viable counter-frequency calculations?" Marin looked at the processor housing she had just climbed out of. "At current degradation rates," she said, "I have maybe 30 hours before I start losing core computational units. The model needs a minimum of 70% function to run the final iteration. I've been keeping it at 73% through the reroutes, but the reroutes themselves are putting stress on systems that weren't designed to run this configuration. I'm patching gaps as they open. I can keep doing that." She paused. "I will keep doing that." The attendant translated. The Emperor's eyes stayed on Marin throughout. When the attendant finished, the Emperor reached into the carved recess of his formal chest covering and withdrew something. He held it out. It was a tool. Not a human tool, a Drakari one, ancient-looking, its handle worn smooth by what must have been hundreds of years of use. The metal of the working end was a deep blue-black, the same void color as the Emperor's scaling. Marin did not know what it was for. She did not need to. She reached up and took it. The Emperor inclined his great head in a gesture that the briefing had described, somewhere in its 40 pages, as the highest acknowledgement one sovereign entity could offer another. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor. Marin sat on the floor of the access corridor for a long moment, holding a 300-year-old Drakari tool, and listening to the distant groan of the station's infrastructure, as the hypercane's shockwaves propagated through Big Orange's outer atmosphere. Then she got back to work. The 30 hours that followed were the worst of Marin Solis' professional life, and she had once spent 4 days in a collapsed mining structure on a moon with no atmosphere keeping a drilling rig running, so a rescue team would have a signal to follow. She kept that on her list of reference points for bad situations. This exceeded it by the 2nd day. The processor units did not fail neatly. They failed in cascades, one unit's degradation stressing the units adjacent to it, which stressed the units adjacent to those, which required reroutes that stressed the systems the reroutes ran through. It was like trying to hold water in a net. Every fix created 3 new places where the net frayed. She stopped sleeping. She stopped eating anything that required more than one hand to consume. She drank cold kaf and kept moving. The Drakari engineers on Suvithkal's team had no idea what she was doing, which was not a criticism. The human auxiliary processors were human-built, and the documentation for them existed only in standard and the proprietary technical dialect of the manufacturer, and Suvithkal's team's standard ran to about 800 words, most of which were scientific terminology. What they could do was fetch. They fetched components, parts, lengths of conduit. They held things when Marin needed a third hand and didn't have one. They watched her work with the careful, focused attention that Marin had come to associate with Drakari engineers, encountering a problem-solving methodology they hadn't encountered before. At the 20-hour mark, the main cooling system for processor Block 7 failed completely. This was not a patchable failure. This was an end failure, the kind where the component was simply gone, and without it, Block 7 would overheat and lock inside of 20 minutes, and Block 7 was running 30% of the model's final iteration. Maren sat down on the floor next to the failed cooling unit. She had been running on 4 hours of sleep and determination and cold calf for a very long time, and she was tired in the specific way that meant her hands were still steady, and her mind was still clear, but her body was registering its objections in a formal and documented manner. Her back hurt. Her knuckles were split in 3 places. The smear of hydraulic fluid was now accompanied by thermal burn marks on her left forearm, where she'd gotten too close to a discharge vent. She looked at the failed cooling unit. She looked at the processor block it was supposed to be cooling. She looked at the temperature reading on the block's status panel, which was climbing in a way that was very calm and very clinical and entirely catastrophic. She thought about the hatchling sound when she'd fixed the toy. She thought about an old Drakari empress making a mechanical creature for a hatchling who hadn't been born yet, with enough precision and care that it would still work centuries later. She thought about the kind of craftsmanship that outlasted the hands that made it. She opened her kit. She could not replace the cooling unit, but she could cool the block by other means, for long enough, if she was willing to sacrifice other systems to do it. The station's emergency gas exchange venting system was rated for atmospheric emergencies, hull breaches, fire events. It ran pipes through every section of the station, including this one. If she rerouted one of those pipes through the Block 7 housing, the gas exchange, which ran at extremely low temperatures, would provide enough cooling to keep the block functional for maybe 8 hours. After that, the gas exchange pressure would drop to a level that triggered automatic shutdown for safety reasons, and she couldn't override that without physical access to the central safety board, which was on the other side of the station. She would also, in the process of rerouting the pipe, be cutting one of the station's emergency gas venting systems for that section. If something else went wrong in that section in the next 8 hours, something requiring emergency venting, there would be a problem. She thought about it for 30 seconds. Then she started cutting. The final computational run began at what the station's chronometers marked as hour 26. Maren was sitting on the floor next to the main processor terminal with her back against the housing, and her legs straight out in front of her, and the Emperor's Drakari tool in her hand. Not because she needed it, but because she had been holding it for most of the last 20 hours, and it had become a habit, a thing to hold while thinking, the way other people held pens or worry beads. The processors were running at 71%, below the minimum threshold she'd originally calculated. She'd had to lower her minimum estimate twice in the last 6 hours as the actual degradation outpaced the projected degradation. 71% might be enough. 71% might not be enough. The model was running. The model would tell her. Suvath Kal was standing at the terminal. The young engineer had been there for the last 4 hours, which was how Maren knew the calculation was close. The Drakari, she had learned, didn't hover unless they were about to witness something that mattered. The storm was audible now. Not the storm itself. Big Orange's atmosphere was 300 kilometers below them, but the harmonic resonance of its shockwaves, propagating up through the gas layers and setting the station's superstructure vibrating at a frequency just below the threshold of human hearing, but well within the threshold of human discomfort. It was the sound, Maren thought, of something very large doing something it had decided to do regardless of what anyone wanted. She had grown up in a place where weather could kill you. She had spent her childhood learning to read the sky for signs of the kind of storm that didn't care about your plans or your house or you specifically. There was a thing that happened in the gut when you were close enough to that kind of scale to feel it. Not fear. Not exactly. Though fear was in there, it was more like a recalibration. A reminder of what the actual default state of the universe was, and how narrow the margin was in which anything small and soft and alive got to exist inside it. The processors kept running. Marin kept holding the tool. At minute 43 of the run, one of the junior Dracari engineers made a sound, a sharp ascending note, and pointed at the terminal. Suvithkal looked, made a longer sound, looked at Marin. The model has converged, the translation came, through the small earpiece Marin had been issued on day one. Suvithkal, it turned out, had learned to use a translation relay when nobody was watching. We have a counter-frequency. It is viable. The array will be reconfigured. Marin exhaled. It felt like the first time she had fully exhaled in 4 days. How long to reconfigure the array? She asked. 6 hours. Perhaps 8. The processors will hold for 8 hours at current degradation. She said it before she checked, and then she checked, and she was right barely, by a margin that she would not have been comfortable sharing aloud. Barely, but they'll hold. Suvithkal looked at her for a long moment. The Dracari engineer was young enough that the expressions weren't fully masked yet. Marin could read something in the set of the jaw, the angle of the neck. Not quite gratitude. Something that might become gratitude, given time and the right conditions. You should sleep, Suvithkal said, in standard without the relay. Marin blinked. I didn't know you spoke standard. I do not, Suvithkal said, with perfect Dracari composure, speak standard. Then the young engineer turned back to the terminal and began issuing rapid-fire instructions to the team, and Marin sat on the floor and laughed for the first time in 4 days. The counter-frequency worked. It took 7 hours and 40 minutes to reconfigure the array, and another 4 hours to calibrate the beam precisely enough to begin the disruption sequence. Marin spent those 11 hours and 40 minutes sleeping on a workbench with her kit bag as a pillow, which was the most comfortable sleep she had in her life, because sleep after the crisis was over was a different category of sleep than the brief terrible sleep she'd been grabbing in the middle of it. She woke up to the feeling of the harmonic resonance in the station's superstructure slowing, quieting. The thing that had been vibrating at the edge of hearing for 4 days was easing, and the absence of it had a physical weight, a relief that she felt in her spine and her shoulders and the heels of her hands. She sat up, found her calf, stared at the processor terminal which showed all units holding at 68%, below minimum, but the minimum was no longer needed. The calculation was done. Suvithkal appeared at the entrance to the workbay. The hypercanic event is dissipating, the young engineer said, in Dracari, which Marin's earpiece rendered into standard. The array will continue disruption sequencing for a further 22 hours to ensure complete dissolution. Structural integrity of the atmospheric collection apparatus is at 91%. The station is not in danger. Good, Marin said. Suvithkal paused. Your processors, they are damaged. Some of them, yes. I can rebuild them couple of weeks. You will require assistance. Marin looked at the young engineer. I generally work alone. Yes, Suvithkal said. You do. And then, precisely, deliberately, in the way of someone who had been thinking about this for a while, it is not efficient. Marin thought about this. No, she agreed. I suppose it isn't. The Emperor found her again 3 days later. She was in a different corridor this time, one of the upper-level maintenance passages, the kind that had actual windows, reinforced and tinted, looking out over the roiling surface of Big Orange. The hypercane was still visible from here, though it was diminishing, its perfect, terrible eye beginning to blur and soften as the counter-frequency did its work. It still looked enormous. It would look enormous for another month, probably, as it unwound. She heard him coming. 11 feet of Emperor was hard to miss, even when he was moving quietly. She turned around. He was with the hatchling. The hatchling looked different. She couldn't have said exactly how, but there was something in how it held itself. Less of that tumbling, not yet in control energy, something slightly more settled. It was carrying the mechanical toy. The toy was moving properly, wings beating in their careful cycle. The hatchling looked at Marin and made the ascending tonal call that she had learned in her 8 months on Vrethsaluna was the greeting between age mates, between equals. She did not have the vocal range to produce it correctly. She tried anyway, her human approximation of the sound, ragged and imprecise and phonetically incorrect. The hatchling's eyes went very wide. Then it made a sound she had no category for at all, something between alarm and delight, and the Emperor produced a sound low in his chest that Marin had never heard before, and that her translation earpiece, after a long pause, rendered as laughter. The Emperor looked at her. He spoke one sentence. The translation earpiece said, "He says you should not try to speak Dracari. He says it sounds like a very determined weather event." Marin grinned. She couldn't help it. She showed her teeth, which was the wrong thing to do, which she immediately remembered, which made her clap a hand over her mouth. The Emperor tilted his head. He opened his own mouth slightly, deliberately, exposing teeth that were large and numerous, and had no agricultural uses whatsoever. The translation earpiece said, "He says among his people, showing teeth to an equal is not a greeting. He says among his people, it is a declaration of context. It means, I see you as something capable of existing alongside me without requiring my protection. He says he has shown teeth to 11 beings in 340 years. He says, you will be 12. The hypercane turned slowly in the atmosphere below them, unwinding itself toward nothing, and Marin Soli stood in a maintenance corridor on a Dracari station, with a broken-knuckled hand pressed to her mouth, and an ancient tool tucked in her pocket, and the Emperor of the Dracari showing her his teeth. And she thought about the hatchling's cry, and the pin she'd had in her pocket, and the way a toy's wings had moved when she'd wound them. And she thought that most of the important things in her life had started with something small, and broken that she had happened to be standing close enough to fix. The report Suvithkal filed with the Science Directorate was 46 pages long. It contained a detailed technical account of the hypercanic event, the failure of the atmospheric collection array, the computational work required to determine the counterfrequency, and the methodologies employed to maintain the human auxiliary processors throughout the crisis period. Page 37 contained a section that read, in the formal technical Dracari of Directorate reports, approximately as follows. The operational continuity of the human auxiliary processor array was maintained throughout the crisis period at acceptable functional thresholds through improvised engineering interventions implemented by the contracted human maintenance specialist Marin Solis. The interventions employed were not standard practice, were not documented in any existing technical literature reviewed by this team, and were in several instances structurally inadvisable by conventional engineering assessment. They functioned without exception. Page 38 contained a subsection that Suvithkal had added at the end, in a font slightly smaller than the rest of the report, which the Directorate's reviewers initially assumed was a formatting error. It is this engineer's assessment that the human approach to mechanical problem-solving warrants further study. The human specialist does not appear to operate from a model of what should work. She operates from a model of what is available. The distinction, over the course of a 96-hour equipment crisis, proved significant. The Emperor read the report in full. He read page 38 twice. He had been reading human technical literature for 8 months, since the day he had first noticed the human mechanic in the station's lower maintenance corridors, moving with the purposeful economy of someone who knew exactly what was broken and exactly how to fix it. He had made no announcement of this. He had simply begun to read technical manuals, engineering assessments, incident reports from human colonial stations. The particular kind of document that human institutions produced when something had gone wrong and been fixed, the after-action report. What he had found in 8 months of reading was something he did not yet have a word for. The closest the Dracari language came to it was a term that translated roughly as the quality of a thing that does not know it should fail. But that wasn't quite it. That implied ignorance. What he found in these documents was not ignorance. The humans were often acutely aware that the thing should fail, that the odds were against them, that the materials were insufficient, and the time was too short, and the damage was too extensive. They fixed it anyway. Every time, with whatever was in their pockets. The Emperor set down the report. He looked out the window of his study at the place in Big Orange's atmosphere where the hypercane had been. The bands of cloud were still churned there, still marked by what had almost happened. In another few months they would smooth out, and nothing would remain to indicate that anything had ever been wrong. He thought about a human woman lying on her back in an access corridor, working by feel and habit, and whatever she happened to have in her kit, keeping a machine alive that by every reasonable assessment should have failed, because a calculation needed to be run, and she had decided the calculation would be run. He thought about the toy. He thought about his mate's hands on the metal, shaping the joints, testing the wing mechanism, adjusting the weight balance with the focused attention she had brought to everything she made. Kareth had been dead for 11 years. He had spent the first 3 of those years being unable to look at anything she had made. He had spent the next 8 years in the slow, effortful process of learning how to look at them again. A human had repaired the thing. A human with split knuckles and hydraulic fluid on her jaw and a fastener in her pocket, who had taken the toy in both hands with the grip of someone who understood what it was worth, and had fixed it in 40 seconds in an access corridor without being asked. He thought that his mate would have found this very funny. Kareth had always found humans funny, in the particular way that meant she found them valuable, the laughter that came from recognizing something unexpected and real. He thought, for the first time in 11 years, that he should find out what else his mate had made. The Colonial Mechanics Union's regional office received a contract extension offer from Vrethsaluna Station 14 days after the hypercanic event. The contract was for 3 years, not the standard 6-month renewable. It included a clause, unprecedented in the union's experience with Dracari employers, that specified the contracted specialist would be provided with a dedicated workshop, a full parts inventory maintained at the union's recommended resupply specifications, and 2 Dracari engineering apprentices who would be assigned to learn the maintenance methodology of the human auxiliary processor array. The regional office sent the contract to Marin Solis with a note that said, in its entirety, "What did you do?" Marin read the contract. She read it again. She read the clause about the apprentices and thought about Suvithkal saying it is not efficient in standard without the relay, with the precise delivery of someone who had been working up to saying it. She sent back a counteroffer that added dental coverage. The Dracari legal team, who had never encountered dental coverage as a contract term, required 4 days to determine what dental coverage was, and whether they were in a position to offer it, and what teeth had to do with engineering contracts. They came back with an amended clause covering not dental coverage specifically, but what they described as maintenance of the biological implements used by the specialist in professional capacity, which covered teeth, hands, eyes, and 2 other human anatomical features, whose inclusion Marin decided not to examine too closely. She signed the contract. On the day she signed it, she was in her workshop, the new one, still smelling of fresh sealant and the particular mineral sharpness of Dracari construction materials, when the hatchling came to visit again. It came around the corner of the workshop entrance with slightly more control than last time, the tail describing a smaller arc, the wings held with more deliberate precision. It was growing into itself. It had the toy in one claw and something else in the other, a small device, clearly Dracari made, the kind of thing that looked simple on the outside and was almost certainly not. It set the device on Marin's workbench and looked at her. Marin looked at the device. She looked at the hatchling. "Is it broken?" she asked. The hatchling made the same ascending tonal call it had made 3 days ago in the corridor, the greeting between age mates, between equals. Marin looked at the device. She picked it up in both hands in the grip that said, "I know what this is worth." "All right," she said. "Let me see." Outside the workshop windows, Big Orange turned in the slow immensity of its own weather, and the bands of cloud where the hypercane had been were already beginning to smooth out, and the station went on in all its 11,000 Dracari complexity, and one human mechanic sat down on a workbench with a small alien device in her hands and began to figure out what was wrong with it. The Emperor, who was standing in the corridor outside the workshop with his back against the wall and his tail still and his eyes on the ceiling, said nothing. He listened to the small sounds of a human working, the calibration pick against metal, the soft exhale of concentration, the minute adjustments of someone who was in the process of understanding a thing. His mate had made sounds like that. The specific quality of silence that surrounded them was the same. The thing he had not had a word for in 340 years of life. The quality of continuing, of taking what was broken and making it work, of not requiring the universe to cooperate but fixing it anyway with whatever happened to be in reach. He thought he might have a word for it now. He thought the word might be human. And then the hatchling made a sound of pure delight because the device had begun to move, and the Emperor of the Dracari closed his eyes and stood in the corridor outside a human mechanic's workshop and let himself, after a very long time, feel something close to hope.